I know that as you are connecting, you have reached our Visions for Justice conversation. My name is Shari Davis. I'm really excited to get us started in just a couple moments. We're going to leave some space for folks to join us, and then we're going to go live on Facebook shortly. At this time, if you want to say hi to folks in chat, please do that. Say hello. Welcome to our Visions for Justice conversation. This is the fourth installment in our 6-part series that may extend, so there may be a lot of parts. So take a moment just to say hi, let folks know your name, where you are, maybe what pronouns you use, and anything else you want to share in the chat, and we will get started shortly. Again, as folks are joining us, and I'm seeing some friendly names in the chat. Hi, everybody. Hi, family. You've joined us at our Visions for Justice conversation, so welcome to you. This is the fourth installment of our 6-part series that may extend. We're going to start in just a couple moments. We'll be live on Facebook. And so let's dive in. I'm seeing so many good things in the chat. If you're in the chat now, say hello, say where you are, include your pronouns if you like, and tell us what you're excited about for this conversation today as we dive into demystifying budgets and really talking about what political education or popular education looks like and why it's important. All right. So, hi, everybody, and welcome to our Visions for Justice series. My name is Shari Davis, and I'm the Executive Director at the Participatory Budgeting Project, also known as PBP. We like acronyms too. I'm excited to welcome everyone to our conversation. As folks join, I'll share that this is the fourth in a series of discussions where we hope to engage our partners and folks in conversation about key issues for justice as they relate to participatory practices. And we created this series to allow for us to engage with all of you and all of our partners, those that are interested in learning more about participatory budgeting, but really participatory democracy, or folks that are currently implementing PB or other innovations in democracy. And really think about the intentional dialogue that we can have and how we can move forward to meet these demands of justice. If we're thinking about innovations in participatory democracy, we really have to center equity and our visions for justice in order for us to all move forward in realizing something that's going to work for us all. At PBP, we enable everyday people to decide together how to spend public money. We create and support PB processes that deepen democracy, build stronger communities, and make public budgets more equitable and effective for all people. PB itself is a democratic process in which community members decide together how to spend a part of a public budget. For more information about how PB works or how to get down with us in our participatory budgeting movement here in the United States and North America, please visit our website, participatorybudgeting.org. But today, as I mentioned, our Visions for Justice conversation is really about demystifying budgets and understanding why political education is important and why it needs to be accessible for all people. I am so thrilled to be in conversation with a couple of amazing folks like Erica Perry from Law for Black Lives and Natasha White from the city of Boston, but also the Hip Hop Caucus. And let me pause for a moment to let them introduce themselves. Erica, let me turn it over to you. Can you give us a quick introduction?
For sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just always super grateful to have these types of conversations. I take so much away from this. So again, grateful to y'all. So I'm Erica Perry. I use any pronouns. I'm a movement lawyer and organizer out of Nashville, Tennessee. I'm on staff with Law for Black Lives, and I'm also like a local organizer with Southerners on the Ground and the National People's Budget Coalition. And so much of my work has been for the past like year or so has been centered around participatory democracy and the work to invest in our communities and divest from policing and incarceration and surveillance. And a lot of that has looked like legal support, providing tools to organizers and communities who are doing on the ground work to really engage budgets to meet the demands of our communities by forcing our city councils, local officials to meet the demands of communities most impacted when we go underinvested in. I think that's all. So I'm grateful again to be here, and I'll pass it back to you, Shari.
Erica, I'm so happy you're here. I'm like, it's really nice to introduce people that are like your real friends, and I'm just so excited to be in this conversation with you. And speaking of real friends, Natasha is also a real friend of mine. And Natasha, you're super amazing. And can you tell the folks like, what you do?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Natasha White. I live and work for the city of Boston. I'm also part of the Hip Hop Caucus. We are a organization for the 21st century. We focus on voting. We focus on empowering communities that are frequently left behind, which is, we know that there's some design behind that. I've been a resident all my life, and I'm very grateful to be able to bring my whole self to my job. And I want to thank PBP and Shari specifically for creating this space for us to chit chat about these type of things, because, knowledge is power, but more than anything, people are power. And so being able to empower those that we touch on a daily basis through a number of mediums, I'm super grateful for. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very appreciative. So thanks, guys.
I'm so happy to have you both in conversation. And, as we move on, I want to jump right in. But for folks that have just joined us on the live stream, I want to just remind you or welcome you to our Visions for Justice conversation. I'm joined with Erica Perry from Law for Black Lives and Natasha White from the City of Boston and the Hip Hop Caucus to really talk about how public budgets work, maybe even to demystify public budgets, and to talk about why it's so important to be able to access political education as we think about our vision for justice. In this conversation, we will invite all of you to share your vision for justice, and we'll hear from our amazing panel about what their vision for justice is. So Natasha and Erica, if you haven't thought about your vision for justice yet, take a post-it note out and write it down, because we will come to you on that shortly. But speaking of jumping in, and I want to use our time together well. Natasha, I want to come to you first with this question. I just talked about demystifying budgets. And let me be honest, when I started doing participatory budgeting work, I worked in the city of Boston just like you. And someone in the budget office actually said, hey, we should really do participatory budgeting. And it created an opportunity for me to really understand what happens even in the budget office. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what the budget office does and like how it works. Like you work in the budget office. It can feel so mysterious. Can you tell us a little bit about generally how public budgets work?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. And I'm really glad that you had a positive experience back home. So budgets, right? You hear a lot of talk about what budgets are, and a common refrain of what a budget is, it's a statement of values, which is very true. Your budget is a statement of values, but it's also what I would like to call a living document, and it's also a plan. So with that, at its very basic level, it's a plan with numbers. We're going to do this, and this is how we're going to pay for it. And so how budgets work, or how they should work, is you have a pot of money that comes from, depending on your municipality, how it's generated. For Boston, the majority of our revenue comes from taxes. I want to say 70 to 75%. And then after that comes state aid, and after that comes fees and fines. So understanding where your revenue comes from. And then out of that, which is a very finite pot of money, you plan. You decide what gets, you have the things that need to be kept, like the lights need to be kept on, right? So you have the things that just need to get paid. Once you figure that out and how much that costs for the next year, because you're doing a budget for the next year, primarily, then you figure out when you have what's left, what you're going to invest in. And so that's where things can get a little challenging because, you have this finite resource and you have to make sure that you're touching all neighborhoods, all projects, all issues. And so budgeting can be challenging, it can be mysterious, but it doesn't have to be. And I hope that as part of my vision for justice, making it so that it's less scary and less accessible, because I feel like budgets cannot be accessible to the common person. That is part of my vision for justice as well. So budgets are plans, they're living documents, and they are a statement of values.
That's real. I want to stick on this just for one more second, but if I could summarize a little bit, I've tried to explain to people how generally public budgets work across the country, whether you're in Boston or anywhere. And tell me if this is right before I ask you my question. So generally, like you just said, a group of people or a small group of people makes a guess about what the potential expenses could be in a city, county, or place. After they make that guess, they present that budget to another group or small group of people. And that group reviews what the guesses are. And they may say, no, I don't agree with this guess. And then there has to be an adjustment. And then the general people are watching what's happening and they can say, wait a minute, we have questions. But they are not a part of either of those bodies that are charged with developing the budget or approving it. Once the budget is passed, that is then the moral document that kind of like governs the plan for all the expenses that happen in that 12-month period for that place. Did I get that right?
You got it right. One thing I would add that I don't think gets a lot of airtime, since we're being real, is the revenue part. So you have to understand where your funding is coming from. A lot of people think, and we know it's there, and that's good enough for us. We know that there's funding. We don't really care too much, or we don't pay a lot of attention to where it's coming from. But for us, particularly in Boston, we have to. And so I would encourage everything you said is right. I think adding to it is understanding where the funding comes from, because when you get into the conversation of, well, how much are we able to spend? One caveat for the city is that we have to have a balanced budget. If you are in your municipality, I would find out if that's the case too. And because we have to have a balanced budget, what goes out has to equal what comes in. And that's really important. So I would just add understanding where it comes from, how much is there, because that predicts what can go out.
Sure. And not to oversimplify it, but cool. The money comes from people that live in the place that pay taxes, right? So I just to make very clear where the money is coming from, right?
It's coming
people.
From you.
Right. Me, right? People that live in the city. Perfect. So here's my question for you before I move on to Erica. What questions do you get about how public budgets work? So you work in a place where you are managing and coordinating and developing a budget in a local government. What questions do people ask you about how they can engage in the budget, and what do you tell them?
So recently, within the last 18 months, we started to do a little bit more engaging of the public, because to your very first point, the budget is spooky, it's this thing, and we know it exists, but and so a lot of times we get very, very basic questions like, well, where does the money come from? Can I get my pothole fixed? And it really depends on where you are, not only in your community, but where you are in your life. So if you are a parent, for instance, your number one issue is going to probably be the quality of your school, right? And if your schools are not up to par, you're going to want to know what you can do as a parent, what's going on, what's going in the budget for around schools, et cetera, et cetera. If you're a senior, you want to know, well, what's the services for seniors? What about my shoveling? What about my trash? So it really, really runs the gamut between where you are in your neighborhood and where you are personally. There are some, pretty, and I use the word basic, like how long is the budget? When does the budget start? If you have someone that's kind of engaged, they want to know when is budget season. So being able to just speak to, very basic knowledge and being able to convey that, those are the type of questions that I get are just basic. Then you have those that are kind of savvy, and then they want to get technical, like, well, what happened to this allocation? Or, well, last year we were at the city council hearing and Councilor XYZ said that we were going to get more trees. So, it really, really does run the gamut. It really, really does run where you are in life. So.
But part of what I'm hearing you say is that people have questions, like reasonable questions, like, how does this work? How do I follow dollars from one place to another? How does this match up to what folks in office are saying in different places, and how dollars come down? And when an organization, or particularly a government entity, says, I don't have any money, like, what does that mean in this bigger government, like, budget picture? Those are some of the questions that you get. I've heard people ask those questions, and people often get nervous, like, am I asking the right question? What I'm hearing you say is those questions are reasonable, and a lot of folks are asking them. And part of it is like, well, how do we make sure that folks can access that information so that we can make the best decisions together? And Erica, this brings me to you. One of the things that I love, and when I describe you as a badass movement lawyer, but one of the things that I love about some of the work that you do is really making this opportunity for political education accessible for people that have questions, for people that are trying to ground in what the issues are. You're even doing teach-ins right now. Can you ground us a little bit and some of what we're up against when we talk about budgets, and when you think about how to ground folks in this conversation? What do you tell them?
Yeah, so I'm grateful for that, because political education, participatory democracy, I think are so important, especially right now in this moment. Because we know that budgets are more documents and visionary documents that are rooted in our desire for our community. And right now across this country, at the local level, the state level, and even onto the federal level, many of the budgets reflect racist, anti-Black, ableist, and transphobic values that are invested heavily in controlling and containing our communities, especially communities that are marginalized, especially Black communities, immigrant communities, folks who have disabilities, trans folks and queer folks, like deeply invested in controlling and containing those communities, not actually in investing in those communities. And so for us, it means that right now, our elected officials, their morals are driven, again, by racism and anti-Blackness. And so as we look at budgets and cities and states, we see that they're investing in prisons and police and jails and surveillance. And this enthusiasm for investing in incarceration and policing is nowhere near the same amount of enthusiasm they should have for education, housing, and making sure our people have houses, just making sure our people have houses and healthcare. There is nowhere near that same amount of enthusiasm for what they have for locking our people up in cages. And that should be heartbreaking and make us deeply angry. And so, again, for us, our jobs as organizers, as movement lawyers, for people who believe in freedom, for people who believe that people should have their basic rights met, our job is to infuse and give our communities the tools they need to actually participate in democracy, to practice participatory democracy, to take our budget back, right? To get our money back and put it in the hands of people who are most impacted when our communities go underfunded and underinvested in, to really all gather together as communities who are directly impacted, as people who believe in freedom, who know that our needs should be met, to create a vision that and a budget that aligns with our vision of safety and community. And so for me, I'm grounded in what our vision is, right? Our vision is one where our community needs are met, where we're actually safe because our needs are met, where police and prisons are actually obsolete, where we can actually address harm in real significant ways without throwing our people away, without isolating our people. And so for me, that's what it's rooted in. That's what drives me to engage in political education and participatory democracy.
I love that, Erica, and I wanna ask you a follow-up question really quickly. But before I do, I wanted to remind everyone that's watching, whether they're with us on Zoom or whether they're with us on Facebook, that you can ask a question too. So if you have a question that you want to bring forward, go ahead and throw it into the chat or the comments, and we will bring it forward for our amazing panel. But Erica, you just talked about such a beautiful vision that I really agree with. And a thing that I've heard you explain that I thought was really important was why you've been doing some advocacy around understanding the impacts of the 94 crime bill and have really been doing some work around what needs to happen kind of next. And I wondered if you could ground us a little bit in that. Like, what is the 94 crime bill? What is the work that you're doing like around this, and why is it important?
Yeah. So right now, just as a part of my work with Law for Black Lives, we're a member of the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom. And so we're working with BYP 100, Center for Popular Democracy, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, the National Council of Formerly Incarcerated and Incarcerated Women and Girls, Policy Link, Dream Defenders, Just Leadership USA, ACRE, and Leadership Conference. And so I name all of them because I think the coalition is made up of groups who are base building organizations, who are like have politics that really align with decriminalization and really undermining what it means to be invested in incarceration. And so our work is to really dismantle and replace the 94 crime bill, which, y'all maybe heard about last night, if you hadn't already heard about it, which, Biden actually led, pushed that bill. And a number of our favorites right now, actually, because people right now are, and many of folks, we found that we are invested in punishment, and so for us, our work is to like shift the narrative around investing in healing, investing in like actual real safety. And so we with police budgets that invest in communities, and so we're looking at dismantling racist, harmful, and punitive policies, which is the 94 crime bill, and then using a participatory process, which is my favorite part, people moving assemblies and popular education and teach-ins and surveys to really surface the issues and impact of the 94 crime bill. Because we know that for many of us, our loved ones, community members, people we went to school with, us ourselves were actually impacted by the 94 crime bill, by the federal government's decision to invest in prisons, to invest in policing, to invest in school resource officers. We know young people who were kicked out of school because of this decision. Yeah. And then I think the other piece that's extremely important to name is that like a large part of it is as they were passing legislation to criminalize our communities and lock our communities up. And this was Republicans and Democrats. Like, I don't want to like just put it on one body. They were also divesting y'all from social services. So when we talk about invest, divest work, when we talk about participatory democracy and participatory budgeting, we talk about it using an invest, divest framework, like saying that we want to actually invest in our communities, because for like years, right? For decades, they have been divesting from social services, divesting from education. And so at the heart of our work is to really surface those issues, surface those problems. And then y'all, which is again, my favorite part, is to be like, let's engage in collective analysis, collective political education, and then also come up with solutions to create replacement legislation. And so this is something that's new that we haven't seen done before, at least in this country, where we're like, we're gonna come together as people who are directly impacted, but people who are marginalized by our cities, by our government, to decide what replacement legislation looks like on the federal level, but also to be using that same analysis on the local level. And so, yeah, that's so much of the people's process is about. And if you want me to, I can talk a bit about the teach-ins, but let me know.
Well, we're going to talk about the teachings, Erica. Don't worry. We're going to talk about that. But before we do, I just wanted to like emphasize this point of like how important it is to understand the impacts of policy decisions and legislation that can have lasting impacts on communities and can really kind of create a platform for deep injustice that's perpetuated. And also what I'm hearing, while that is all true, that's like what we're up against, right? That's the grounding that we need to face and reckon with. There's a real opportunity. There's a real opportunity to change. There's a real opportunity to do things different. There's a real opportunity to reimagine and tap in to our collective power to do that. It's not going to be one person or one small group of people behind a closed door that determines what that looks like. And there's an opportunity for us not to default to the status quo and to really say, we can do this completely different. And that's what I hear you saying, Erica. And that's what I hear you kind of alluding to a little bit, Natasha, when you first started this conversation. And I want to come back to you and I want to ask you both this question. And before I do, I want to remind everyone that if you have a question that you want to ask either of our panelists, you totally can bring that forward either on Facebook with a comment in our chat, or on Zoom. If you're with us on Zoom, you can put a chat into the chat box and we'll make sure that we bring your question forward. But before we go to our audience Q&A, I have one more question for you all. I'm going to go to you first, Natasha. You're in a place where you are thinking about, and it's tough. I worked in government, right? So I was in a place where I was like, man, I have to navigate a lot. I really want to engage people deeply, to radically imagine how we do things differently, but it felt like there were some constraints that I was managing. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what opportunities you see from where you sit to really change the way that we do things, in particular when it comes to public budgets.
That's a really great question, and I'm going to try my hardest to answer it succinctly. So one of the things that we can do, and one of the ways opportunity presents itself is through reconciliation, right? And understanding that, look, stuff has been janky for how many ever years, and it's been perpetuated, it's been continued. We are now at this watershed moment, you know, for most of us, it's been like this, like we've been arrived to this. This is, some people are late to the party. How do we start doing some healing work, right? Because we're restoring things and understanding that we're trying to correct wrongs. So that's an area of opportunity, is actually, I would like to say, recreate the table, right? Yeah. A lot of people think it's bringing people to the table, which is a fact, but the table is the one that's the common denominator. So how do we reimagine? How do we change the table? Another way we can foster change, or another opportunity, is looking at our processes, looking at the way we do things. And to Erica's point, like, are we reaffirming the wrongs that have been done? Are we continually perpetuating the wrongs that we're doing via our processes? And if we are, how do we start again, right? I think that's a very, very big window of opportunity. But also another opportunity is just the collaboratory way we can do things. You know, government is siloed, you know, it's bureaucratic, it's all of these things that we know. How do we start breaking down those silos? How do we start developing frameworks that can be applied to all the city departments, because we all are trying to get to a common goal? So I think those are some opportunities for change and for positive change.
Yeah, that's so deep. This very real recognition that we need to heal, we need to acknowledge, we need to reckon with, and then we need to collaborate, and then we need to build some infrastructure, like, so that it works. You know, Erica, I really want to hear your kind of thoughts on this. Like, what opportunities do you see? You laid out some really important grounding. You alluded to this, like, we have a space to reimagine. What does that look like? You know, for me, I'm just thinking about this moment that we're in, the messaging that I'm receiving as a person in this democracy in the United States. And I'm wondering, for you, when we talk about the issues that are being perpetuated and the opportunities that we see as we tap into what could be collective power, what does that look like in your mind?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think I want to just name one piece is that we know that for us, the complexity there, like I name elected officials, right? Because for us, and I'll say I'm an organizer with the National People's Budget Coalition. And so for us, our targets are elected officials, right? And so I know we're going to engage in a discussion a little later. And one of the questions I've been holding is like, how do we engage with folks who are doing the work that you're doing, Natasha, doing the other side of the work? But for us, elected officials voted on the budget, and were the ones who decided they wanted to invest in policing, right? And not actually make sure our people had access to housing. And so I'm holding that, right? As we say, what does collaboration look like, and who do we collaborate with? And what does it look like to gather to wield our power as communities who are most impacted and communities who care about each other? And so kind of the opportunities there, I think there are two that I'm really holding. One is like, as a movement attorney, a movement lawyer, a lot of the work is putting tools in the folks' hands, is to like demystifying the process, right? The budgeting process, demystifying the way local and state government works, and even federal work, the federal government, which necessarily isn't my work. And so, but we are working with organizers who are working with directly impacted communities to fight for what communities need. And some of that is like we're doing trainings, like the opportunities they are doing trainings through our Freedom Labs. And shout out to Participatory Budgeting Project, who has been a part of our Freedom Labs, to really let organizers know like what participatory budgeting looks like and what the opportunities there are, like what it makes possible when we engage in participatory democracy. But I think the other piece is like breaking down and analyzing these cities' budgets and local budgets, because they're oftentimes extremely complicated and thousands of pages. And we're like, okay, and for many folks can feel intimidating. So we're like, let's break it down. Let's get to the nuts and bolts. And I think the other piece is really like strategizing with each other. And so what's exciting is like throughout the country, there are a network of organizers and organizations who are engaging in divest, invest campaigns, who've articulated a vision of justice, a vision of communities that don't involve the police, right? That don't involve prisons, but that do involve housing security, that do involve healthcare and food security and food justice, that do involve education and transportation. And so I think for that, like gathering folks to engage in those campaigns. And so at the same time, while we're saying, let's end money bail, let's end pretrial detention, we're also seeing what we want to invest in, and that's needs. And so we're using that collective analysis, we're learning from each other. So there's an opportunity there. So if I can look and see what's happening in Nashville and Durham and be like, what worked there? How can I apply that here in Nashville or, you know, in Minneapolis or Wisconsin? I think the other opportunity as a local organizer with the National People's Budget Coalition is we're using participatory democracy. And I'm so excited about participatory democracy because we're using it as a tool to combat local and state infrastructure and really elected officials who take away our power, who are deeply in bed with the business class, right? Who for us in Nashville are like, whatever developers say, we want to do it. What the police want, we're going to give it to them. But when we ask about, can we make sure we have more bus routes, they say no. Or can we make sure our people have housing, they say no. And for us, we're using participatory democracy to create the future that we know we deserve. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. And I think the other piece is, as we are both like gathering our tools, we're engaged in collective analysis to decide to create a people's budget, y'all, to be like, what's a people's budget look like through participatory budgeting. And even while, you know, we are trying to push, at least locally, elected officials to listen to the will of the people, we're engaging in that process together. So there's an outside inside game that feels like really exciting and like a huge opportunity for local communities to be engaging in.
Erica, I'm like jumping out my seat. I see Natasha coming off mute. Before you speak, Natasha, I'm not going to take anything away from you. I just wanted to remind folks that are just joining our conversation. You're here with me, Shari Davis, the Executive Director at the Participatory Budgeting Project, and you've joined our Visions for Justice conversation with Natasha White of the City of Boston and the Hip Hop Caucus, and Erica Perry from Law for Black Lives. Natasha, you were just about to say something. Go ahead, friend.
So I wanted to kind of piggyback on what Erica said, particularly around the engagement piece. So people should feel that they should be able to participate in their budget now even if there isn't a formal participatory budget element. The challenge is, to what Erica said and what you alluded to, Shari, is this, spooky, written in, the math and numbers, and, it's kind of like old English. And so it can be intimidating. And sometimes even for me, I have to kind of get a little bit, well, what does this mean? I even have to ask questions. So it definitely is there. The intimidation factor is very real. But this is one thing I want to leave you with, and not leave, but, I want to put in the atmosphere. And it's public money, public people, it's public input, and it's a public process. It's those three things. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter, who's at the head. It doesn't matter what your councilman says. Those three things remain. And so going into that as an individual, as a member of your municipality, you have a right to ask questions. City of Boston has a budget website where the budget is uploaded in both versions. There's different versions between recommended and adopted. So we have that. One of the things that came out of last year's pilot is we have a one-pager, and that basically gives you a breakdown of the budget process. And even that can be, we did it as simple as possible, but usually that, and it's a good thing, it begets questions. And so one of the things as a municipal worker, if you work in the budget or any department, is you're a public servant. And so you should be able to participate and engage the public no matter what your domain is. And so, yes, it's spooky. Yes, it can be overwhelming, but I encourage people to start asking questions. Start asking your city councilor or your assembly person. Go to the top. I mean, it's there for you. You pay into it because you pay taxes. Therefore, you have input, and it impacts you. So you have a right to do so.
So you're hearing live and direct from a person that works in a budget office that public budgets are public dollars that people in community put forward, and they should have an opportunity to shape that. And if you don't have an opportunity to shape what happens in terms of your public budget that is spent around you, there's really an opportunity for you to advocate for that. Think back to what Erica just described. She just talked about tools and resources that need to be put into people's hands. Erica's work is making sure that that happens, but us at the Participatory Budgeting Project, we're doing that too. With our campaign, Democracy Beyond Elections, we're saying who is ripe and ready, that wants to really focus on their vision for justice and center community decision-making that is equitable, accessible, and significant. And if that's you, we want to work with you to make sure that you have the resources to do that and the support to do that, so that you can work with folks like Natasha to make it happen. And so I just wanted to remind folks of that. And I'm just really excited about what we're talking about. We're talking about the challenges that exist, but again, what is possible when we organize together and when we think about how to push back against what we see right now, what is the status quo, and to really realize what is possible. So at this time, I do want to go to some audience comments and acknowledge I've been asking a lot of questions to our amazing panelists. They have me so excited, but I want to pull in some of your voices. So if you have a question, now is a moment to put that into the chat, whether that's on Facebook or Zoom. But Natasha and Erica, I'm going to bring in this first question that comes from our chat. Question one is, have you all, in the work that you do, utilize the census for your budgeting work, and in particular for your planning for budgeting? Do you use census data to think about your engagement strategy, or do you use census data at all? Does that come up in the work that you do to engage folks in budgets or political education?
Me first or Erica? I'm sorry.
You pick. You started talking. Go ahead.
I started talking. Yeah, me and my. So the short answer is no, not to my knowledge. The census is more of a federal thing. It contributes to the federal dollars, and how the federal dollars are allocated or not, to cities, programs, et cetera, roads, you name it. So federal infrastructure. However, I think that census tract information can be extremely helpful when you look at things such as quality of life, life expectancy, et cetera, et cetera. So while they don't inform our decisions directly, I think having access to census tract data and census data overall could be beneficial.
So what you're saying is the census data determines dollars that come to a city, right? So it determines like how much money a city could use to make decisions about improvements or investments, right? So there's a formula that happens there. But secondly, the city itself can use, they may or may not, but they can use census data to make decisions about how they allocate dollars to serve the people that live there.
I would say that would be my assumption, because again, when you're looking at census tract data, it gets super granular into like zip codes and areas of the city. So if you see, for example, quality of life, right? Census tract data can tell you the average age range of life, right? A male that lives in the South End is expected to live to 75. I'm just throwing numbers out there. So that could influence how HHS, the Health and Services Department, looks at, targeted health concerns, right? If more men in that age group in that area die of prostate cancer, maybe HHS can come up with a campaign to, influence and to inform around prostate cancer. So while it may not directly be used, census tract data could be used when you start getting into like the nitty gritty of things that the census tracks.
That makes a lot of sense. And for those of y'all that don't know, HHS means Health and Human Services, former government employee, just letting y'all know. If you have questions about that, put it into the chat. Now, Erica, I want to ask you the same question. Do you use census data, or is there a value to census data in the work that you do?
So we don't use, or we haven't, and I'll speak locally because that's like where it would be most applicable. We don't use census data, but I think that what would feel helpful is powerful now. It's like being able to look and see where our people are by zip code to determine, and then being able to see how money is spent. And so I think out of LA, they just did a report. What's the name of the coalition? Justice LA did a report, Million Hoods. I think, sorry if I'm saying it wrong, where they broke down the dollar amount for each kind of like neighborhood. And for us, that would be interesting to look at in Nashville. And I mean, we have I believe we know, right? The money they spend on policing compared to education in specific zip codes is like extremely different and doesn't line up. And so that information would be really helpful. And I think the other piece is, so when we surveyed our people around like what they would like to see in the budget, to create a budget amendment during the budgeting process earlier this year, we asked folks what their zip codes were so that we could both be able to move their elected officials based off of like what district they are in, but also to be able to figure out like what people are saying based on their zip code. And so I think it could be helpful, and like want to think more about that with the local coalition.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is there's a real opportunity to be able to use census data to understand some demographics and mobilize around that. That's really real. Now, our chat's popping, so I do want to move to a couple other questions, so bear with me, y'all. This one has two parts, and it goes out to the both of you. So whoever asked this question, shout out to y'all for asking a very detailed question. The question is, Natasha, can you share some instances or examples of groups or communities or populations who have created the table? You talked about like creating the table before. So can you share some examples of groups, communities, or populations who have created the table? And Erica, how has creating the table looked for you in the work that you're doing around the 94 crime bill, like teach-ins? Like, what does that look like? And the last thing that this person said is, can you really just paint me a picture of what creating the table looks like? So Natasha or Erica, either of you could start. But yeah, so again, the question is, what are some examples, instances, groups, communities that have created this table, Natasha, that you referred to earlier? And Erica, in your work, what does that creating table look like? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. Just to talk a bit about the teachings, I want to just name the reason we're doing the teachings. And so for us, when we talk about the 94 crime bill and its like impact on our communities and how it's been so harmful and what we want to replace it with, we know we want to do it through people movement assemblies and surveys, which means talking to people to again surface those issues and like envision what replacement legislation looks like. And to do that, we know we want to make sure we have a collective analysis around like what's inside of the 94 crime bill and its impact, like data on its impact. So the teachings for us is a part of like participatory democracy because it is political education. And so we're doing it wide scale. We're doing wide scale political education through our teachings for folks throughout the country. And so we're looking at the different components of the crime bill. And so like, you know, we look at the piece of the crime bill that focused on prisons, like the billions of dollars that went towards prisons, the billions of dollars, like $14 billion went to policing, and then sentencing, this 3 strikes rule, and then sentencing enhancements, and then of course the impact on immigration and school resource officers. And so breaking that down and really like grounded it in a historical analysis of controlling specifically Black folks through like criminalization and incarceration and how that's been expanded to like the wider population. So analyzing those together. And then I think the other piece is like infusing that with our politics, right? Politics of abolition, politics of Black queer feminism and anti-capitalism. And so we're excited to, you know, come together through story circles. So a part of that is through like lifting up the stories of folks who are impacted, to really put a name, a face, a family and community to like these impacts, but then also through like breaking down the data, right? Putting numbers to it as well. And so we do that once a month.
Is that the teaching that you were talking about before?
Yeah.
How do people come to those?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we're doing teachings once a month leading up to the People Moving Assemblies. And so folks can join. I'll drop the link. We have a teaching actually tomorrow that'll be focused on incarceration and the impact of incarceration, right? Because we know real people who we love and care about have been impacted by incarceration. And so we want to lift up those stories and really analyze what it looks like to go from slavery to incarceration and the role the 94 crime bill plays in that arc, right? But also what's possible, because we know there are other things that are possible and another world is possible. And so I'll drop the link. Shari will also be on
No, they already got you. I think the link is already in there. But just to recap, what I think Erica said was, if you want to get a really good picture in addition to what they just shared about what building this table looks like in terms of their work, come tomorrow to the teach-in. And if you can't make it tomorrow, there'll be another one. There's one every month. So I think that's what Erica just said. And there's a link in the chat right now. If you don't see it on Facebook or on Twitter, we will make sure that you have an opportunity to see it on Facebook or Zoom and sign up for the teach-in. So that's how you can be a part of the table, see it up close and see how it's built. Natasha, same question for you. You mentioned you were the one that brought up the table and recreating it. So can you talk to us a little bit about what examples you've seen of that?
Sure. Erica brought up a really good point around data. You know, we live in a very data-driven society now. And so during this past budget cycle, we saw an immense outpouring of people who were really concerned around the budget and how, particularly policing, the finances behind policing. And so there were a number of groups that were just really, really powerful in their delivery, astute and very, very sharp. I'm going to be completely honest, there were quite a few, and the names slip my mind right now. Please forgive me, it's a little delay. But the ACLU actually did a phenomenal job of really getting into the nitty gritty around police overtime and the police budget overall. So I think the ACLU was a very, very was a surprising table builder, if you would, because of what the fire that they brought in. Armani White is on the call right now. Shout out to Armani. I hope you're doing well. He works part of the Center for Economic Democracy, and that's another table builder, if you would. And Shari, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention your work around participatory budgeting in Boston. I would be, you would defriend me and I would not be mad if I did not bring up your work around participatory budgeting at the hall and with Youth Leads to Change. And so what we see is a lot of groups that have, you know, a lot of interest, as they should, coalition building amongst themselves and bringing it to their city councilors, bringing it to the hall, bringing it to department heads, whoever they can talk to. So that would be some of the ways that these tables are being built in real time.
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to make sure that we get at least another couple questions, but time is flying, y'all. And for folks that have just joined us, thank you for coming on this journey with us. You've reached our Visions for Justice conversation. This is the fourth in our series. My name is Shari Davis, and I'm joined with two amazing and brilliant folks, Natasha White and Erica Perry. And I want to keep moving through Q&A, but just to say really quick, Natasha, there's no unfriending. You're stuck with me, and we will continue to build tables together. And so this next question goes out to you, Erica, who's also stuck with me, and we're going to continue to build tables together. And that is, this is a tough one, maybe. What do you think about the next right thing to do for other cities like Minneapolis City Council, for example, given their first try at Divest Invest? It wasn't smooth. So what do you think is the next right thing to do for cities that are in a circumstance like Minneapolis?
Yeah, that's difficult for me to answer. One of them being I don't live in Minneapolis, so I try not to tell people what they should do in other cities. But I can speak to Nashville because that's where I live and that's where I organized and practice. And so because for us, we engaged in a budget fight where people did turn out and call city council during the budget hearing and say, defund the police, defund caging, invest in education. And we did say, and we did 5,000 people completed a survey where they said how much money they wanted to take from the sheriff's office, how much money they wanted to take from the police department and the district attorney's office, and where they wanted to put it. People said housing and education and alternatives to policing and incarceration. And folks, you know, we mobilized folks to really call and push and talk to their city council members about a budget amendment that didn't include putting more money into the police department and into the sheriff's department. And city council failed our communities, right? And so we find ourselves in another moment where, again, our elected officials failed to honor the wishes, desires of our communities. And so right now, and so what we decided to do after that, and it happened in June, we said, well, we'll engage in participatory democracy. So we had always been committed to participatory budgeting, right? We had always been committed to participatory democracy. So for us, what we decided to do was use people movement assemblies to create our own people's budget, right? To engage communities on a wide scale early on too, right? Because you know, the budgeting process starts right after the the budget is passed. The next budgeting process starts. So we were like, yo, we're gonna engage in early. We're gonna gather our people early. And I think the other thing is we're gonna organize our community members. We're gonna shift the narrative around what public safety is, because some community members heard us when we said defund police, defund cages. They thought we meant take away safety, and so we had to like interrupt that narrative and say, actually, we know policing cages don't keep us safe. We have the data that says that sexual violence has not gone down because we've like bloated police and sheriff's budget, right? That harm in our community has not gone down because we bloated police and jail budgets. And so continuing to engage in political education, I think is one major thing to gather our people to be like, what are our solutions, right? What are we imagining for each other? And creating a budget that reflects that. So for us, that's the next move. But I also want to name that, you know, other components of participatory democracy that I think we should also be thinking about is electoral justice, right? Because it matters who's in city council, right? Our city council they failed us, right? So do we want to keep electing them? Nah, right? I think the other piece is, you know, really investing in alternatives. What do alternatives look like? Like thinking about solidarity economies and cooperatives. And so for us, we're really experimenting. I think I've seen communities experimenting with both of those things at the same time. So as we are destroying institutions and infrastructure that don't keep us safe, that harm our communities actually, policing and jails, we're also rebuilding with things that like keep us safe, that actually address harm. So things like Gideon's Army and violence interruptions, and so violence interrupters. And so some of y'all might know of those in your communities. And so I think that's for us the next kind of step. And I imagine that, and you know, our analysis and what we think about doing is also informed by talking to other organizers throughout the country.
So what I'm hearing you say, Erica, is like the next step is to keep going and to work together, to continue to evaluate, to continue to push, to continue to reimagine. This work of reimagining, it sounds nice, but it's really important for us to get where we're going and for us to do it together. And it's iterative. It has to be. It's not going to be one group by themselves. It's not going to be one intervention like PB. It's going to be several things together in concert that get us where we're going. This makes me want to talk about democracy beyond elections, but I'm going to hold on to that for 1 second because, Natasha, there's a really important question that's actually burning for me that came in through the chat. And that question was, can you just tell us how we even get connected to the budget process? Like, when does it start? How do we find out? Like, how do we even, it just happens like Erica said, and then it's there, and then you miss it, and then you have to start for next year. So how do we avoid that? How do we get plugged in as it stands right now?
I am so glad that you asked that question. I've been waiting with bated breath to kind of address that. So Erica made a very, very good point, and I'm very glad that she did it. So budgets run on a fiscal year. And so the minute that budget is passed and approved July 1st, that's when the next year's budget cycle starts. Vocabulary is very important when you're talking about something as obtuse as a budget, and knowing the budget season isn't this it's not this encapsulated time where you have to get in and that's the only time and only opportunity that you have. People who are super savvy when it comes to the budget, they are already lobbying their city councilors, they're lobbying the particular department where their issue is rooted in. They have these people's numbers on speed dial. So what I would suggest is, one, know your fiscal year, right? Know when your budget starts, know when it ends. That's one way to that's the first step in getting involved. Second, know that you can advocate and you should advocate year throughout the year. It does not have to be a special day. It doesn't have to be a certain time. It doesn't have to be when it's a full moon. You start getting involved the day July 1st, point blank. Talk to your city councilors. Boston is unique in that we have district councilors and at-large councilors. And so what I like to remind people is that you have 5 people on the council that you need to be pinging whenever you have an issue. This isn't just related to the budget, but just in general. It's your district councilor and your 4 at-large. Get them involved, let them know your concerns, your cares, etc. Also know, and this is important, know the budget process as far as who signs what, who approves what, know the powers that be. It's very important, particularly when Erica had mentioned Minneapolis, they have, I think, a council heavy mayor soft way, where what that basically means that the council is the one that not only approves it, but enacts it, right? It's a strong council, weak mayor. In Massachusetts, in Boston, we have a strong mayor, weak council. So wherever you are, knowing the dynamics of the power dynamics is super important, because not only do you need to know who has what, who holds what power, but to the degree. Like, do they have veto power? Do they have line item power? Those type of things are very important. And so I know this is all a lot, but trust me, it will make your advocacy a lot better. Another thing about the budget process is the squeaky wheel gets the oil. I mean, it's sad, but true. And so I think collaborating is super important because your issue, I'm pretty sure other people have it. Your concern, I'm sure other people have it. And so partnering up with the right people to move it forward collaboratively and collectively would be beneficial. And I can go on and on about the process, but I know we're at time.
No, Natasha, and I hope it's okay, y'all. I just have like literally, I swear, like 2 more questions. I'm gonna let y'all go. Just give me 10 more minutes if that's cool. But when people they ask me this question all the time. I used to defend the budget for the mayor's department to city council, and they used to ask me this question all the time, like, how do I get involved? And I used to say there are 3 questions, and you just hit on all of them. When does the fiscal year start? And you know that 4 or 5 months before that, the budget is being proposed. So that's just a good indicator for you. When does the fiscal year start? And then 4 or 5 months before that, there's usually some budget proposal, just to give you a picture. The second one is, what's the system? Is it a strong mayor, weak mayor, city manager? If you don't know the right question to ask, Natasha gave you good language. Just say, is it a strong mayor system? And whoever you ask will know what you're talking about, and they will answer, and then you can go understand what that means. And then the third thing that Natasha said is reach out often and regularly. I told you at the beginning of this, in my opinion, the way that budgets work is that a group of people make a guess. They make a guess based on information that they have. That information can come from a lot of voices, but a lot of ways, but loud voices tend to really be heard. So if you're asking questions, there's an opportunity for that loud voice to be yours. And I just think that was really, really good advice. I have 2 more questions, y'all. Bear with me.
Sorry.
Go ahead, E.
I just wanted to lift up a toolkit that we did with BYP 100 and Center for Popular Democracy. That's like a resource guide on how to engage your city budget. I dropped it in the chat box, but I think it's like super helpful.
Yeah, so check that out, y'all. So that is the Loud for Black Lives toolkit and tip sheet that gives you some advice on how to engage with folks in this conversation about public budgets beyond the kind of quick 3 to 4 tips that Natasha and I just gave you. And there are 2 more questions that come from our group before I ask you what your vision for justice is, which is the question of the night. So here's one that could be really quick. Do you all work with, do any of your organizations that you all are connected to work with corporations in this work for participatory democracy? Do you all work with corporations in this work for better understanding and advocating for equitable public budgets? Is that a thing that y'all do?
Mine is pretty short. So in my day life, no. We are the corporation. So that's the job. As far as the Hip Hop Caucus is concerned, do we directly work around budgeting? Not necessarily, howbeit ever. We work with a number of other partner nonprofits and organizations to move forward justice, particularly around climate change, environmental justice, and voting. We touch on a number of other topics, but Reverend Yearwood, shout out to him, and our whole Hip Hop Caucus is really heavy around climate and environmental justice. So the answer is no right now, but that could change.
What about you, Erica?
No, I think we are really careful about who we work with, and so I guess y'all can imagine developers take up a lot of space, and so and it depends on which corporation you're talking about. So we just want to be careful and make sure if we are working with folks that align with our vision for justice, which we'll talk about.
So what I'm hearing is maybe, and there are opportunities, but the number one thing is that folks have to be value aligned. And I want to name that at the Participatory Budgeting Project right now, we are talking about democracy beyond elections. This is a campaign that we just launched about 2 weeks ago where we're saying, hey, if you're an individual, a person at an organization that wants to incorporate this principle of participatory democracy that is community-led decision-making, that is equitable, significant, and accessible. If you're a person or a part of an organization that wants to do that, then you can sign on to Democracy Beyond Elections. And we work with folks like Erica Perry to put tools and resources in your hands to make sure that you can do that in your organization or your corporation. If you're a corporation that is values aligned and wants to make sure that several other corporations sign on to advance our vision of justice, that's a thing that you can do with us, and you can sign on at democracybeyondelections.org. All right. We're coming into the home stretch. I have one more question before we get a chance to hear your and everyone else's vision. And if you all that are listening to this conversation want to get a head start with sharing your vision for justice with us, you can do that in the chat. Tell us, what is your vision for justice, as we ask Erica and Natasha this last question and then hear their vision for justice. So the question is, where do you see the best opportunities for intergroup reconciliation in the budget process? This is a tough question. So as we've talked before about deep systemic inequity and folks really having to learn to understand what the issues are, be grounded in the issues, understand history, and then be able to collectively make decisions together. What opinions do you all have, or what experience have you seen in this idea of intergroup reconciliation? Do you have any thoughts or ideas for us?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm going to apologize in advance that I might not answer it completely. But I think when you talk about intergroup restorative justice, the first thing that needs to be done, in my opinion, is an understanding. It's coming to an understanding and coming to an agreement. And, what are we trying to fix here? What's broken? Do we agree that it's broken? And how do we go forth with fixing it? Keyword being we. So, and are we hearing all of the voices? With the understanding that, unfortunately, because we are not all knowing, we run the risk of not capturing everything. But if and when that happens, what are some safeguards and some tools to make sure that no one's left out, and making sure that voices are heard, making sure that people feel seen? So that would be my first step, is just articulating the hurt, articulating the need for healing, and being able to listen.
Absolutely. What about you, Erica? What do you think about this opportunity for intergroup reconciliation?
Yeah, I think it depends on which groups, right? Some groups there's room for reconciliation. For other institutions, there's the reconciliation is like for you not to exist. And when I say not to exist, I'm talking about the police. I'm talking about prisons and jails, right? That reconciliation, the way we repair that harm is to not exist. And then we can talk about other types of reparations, and other ways to really articulate the ways that those institutions have been harmful. But I think on the other side, if we're talking about groups like elected officials, which elected officials, they exist for the moment, right? But if we're talking about institutions like local governments, that reconciliation, I think, looks different. So one really amazing example, I would look at some of the work they're doing in Asheville, actually, where they named we have been harmful as an institution to Black communities, to marginalized communities in this city, right? And are really thinking about what it looks like to both address those issues by stopping the policies and practices that are harmful, acknowledging that they're harmful, and replacing, I think, with something that actually is not harmful, and actually I think addresses the needs and desires of community members. So I think that's what that could look like. And again, I think another way to really engage that is through wide-scale participatory democracy, because so many of our community members don't trust, and rightfully so, local, state, federal governments. And I think a part of that is for us as organized and movement lawyers is really thinking about a practice of participatory democracy where we are collectively wielding our power to force the hand of elected officials who, in some instances, would not carry out the needs of community members. And so I think it depends on what groups we're talking about, to be honest.
Yeah, like part of what I'm hearing you say is that we can't conflate like reconciliation to mean accountability or acknowledgement. Those may be parts of reconciliation, but we can't just be like, well, that's all it is. And while there's healing that's required, reconciliation also requires actual change, like an actual change in the way that things happen, not an acknowledgement of it and a continued perpetuation of what that looks like. Things need to be different. And so going into a healing process, even if it is intergroup, doesn't mean that we come out on the other side with things that have been proven to be harmful for hundreds of years. And I think that that's such a really good and important point, that we can allow folks to step into each other's shoes, have conversations, and understand what people are dealing with. But that doesn't mean that at the same time we have to fuel things that have been known to cause harm. So Erica, thank you for that. And thanks everybody for being in this conversation. It's not just Erica and me and Natasha, it's so many of you. Thank you all for beginning to share your visions for justice. Now is my favorite time where I get to ask our panelists what their vision for justice is. But I want to encourage all of you to share with us what your visions for justice are. Erica, let me tell you right now that people are registering for your teach-in. I saw several people just let me know in the chat, I am registered and I will see you tomorrow. So get excited for that. And as Erica and Natasha share their vision for justice with us, again, I want to call on y'all to share your vision for justice with everyone, because I think when we manifest these things, they really and truly do happen. So who wants to go first? Natasha, Erica, what is your vision for justice?
I can go. Yeah, I'm always really moved when I think about things like this, and like again, really grateful for this opportunity and that folks, have a vision for justice that you want to articulate and work with people to implement. But when you ask this question, I think about Tracy Corder, who Shari, with Acre, who when we're in trains together leads us to this exercise where we close our eyes and we're like, and she asks us like, what does your perfect day look like? And for me, when I think about my vision for justice, I'm thinking about that. Like it is communities where our people are practicing like real direct democracy, have a say so in what their communities look like. I think communities where if folks are sick or need to go to the doctor can go to the doctor, right? Without having to worry about like having to pay for it. And I think communities where people, who can work, have jobs that are where they are treated with dignity and humanity and have a real wage. And communities where if we want to ride the bus, we have bus stops where we can actually get from one side of town to the other. And then where teachers and support staff actually are paid wages that align with the work they are doing, right? Where they're actually paid like equitable and dignified wages. And students go to schools that are fully funded, and they don't have to decide. The education they have access to isn't decided on what zip code they live in or what neighborhood they live in. And I think the other piece is where we actually have space to practice transformative justice, where we can deal with harm and deal with conflict without feeling like we'll be isolated or thrown away in a cage, where we can actually address real issues. I think it's also being able to drive down the street, and if our car breaks down, we're not afraid that the police will come and stop us and harass us, or that we're not afraid. For me, my vision of justice doesn't include policing. It doesn't include jails. It includes like communities actually being able to walk down the street, young people being able to go to like fully funded schools, and actually exist in their full humanity.
Erica gonna bring me to tears, y'all. I really like your vision for justice. Thank you so much. Natasha, what's your vision for justice?
Thanks, y'all. My vision for justice includes reflective leadership. Um, leadership that looks like me and sounds like me and has had similar experience as me, and it's not a bad thing, right? Restorative democracy, being able to restore, I think, is a big thing, and being able to, again, acknowledge the wrongs that are continuing, acknowledge that change needs to go down, and that it's not one versus the other. We're equalizing. We're not trying to necessarily get a one up. We're trying to equalize. We're trying to get to where we should be, but the systems and the systematic processes have prevented that from happening, right? My vision for justice is just because I'm Black, being Black isn't a health risk, right? I'm not at a health, I'm not predisposed to high blood pressure, diabetes, kidney disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Just based off of how I look, that's not a health risk. Access is a part of my vision for justice. Access to wealth, access to health. Just because I live in X place, why do I have to have, a subpar or just making it healthcare system? You know what I mean? And I don't, thank God, but what if someone who lives a street over from me has that problem? So being able that for everybody to have access, I think that's a big, big part of my vision for justice. Breaking down silos is part of my vision for justice. We understand that somebody has to make a decision, right? But does that decision have to be made in a silo, in a closed caption? Why can't we all be part of that process? Or why can't we all have a voice, to lend to that process? And, just a place where me being a Black woman is no different than anybody else. That's a really, really big part of my vision for justice. For all the talk about, racism and the fact that there's a debate if racism exists and post-racial error and everything else, that's insulting to me, who has to live and breathe this thing. And so being able to just exist, there's a song, and I'm showing my age, but Common's album, like Water for Chocolate,
yes,
had a song called A Song for Asada. And she distinctly said, he asked the question, well, what does freedom look like? And she said, I can't tell you what freedom looks like because I've never been free, but I tell you what I think it is. And so that's for me is like, I can tell you what I think it's going to be. And I want to be able to be Black and be okay. And that's not a problem. And I want to be a woman, and that's not a problem. So that's what my vision of justice includes.
Whew. Y'all, these are beautiful visions of justice. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Natasha, for sharing such beautiful, powerful visions. I have my little notebook out and I was trying to jot down as much as I could as you all were talking. And I want to acknowledge that folks in the chat that are watching with us, they're sharing their visions. Thank you for sharing your beautiful visions for justice. If you had a question today that we didn't get to, don't worry. This is only the fourth part of a longer series, and we're going to keep this going. So every other Wednesday, 2 weeks from now, you can find us at the same place for the fifth episode of our Visions for Justice series that is going to be really, really exciting. But before we go, if it's okay with y'all, I wanted to share my vision for justice. And it's short. I try to keep it short because we went over time just a little bit. But my vision for justice is so deeply tied to what you, Natasha, and what you, Erica, shared. And what I think about is this opportunity for us to tap into our collective power and creativity and shape the reality around us with things like democracy beyond elections, real tools that exist for us to learn, grow, and shape the reality around us so that government doesn't have to be what it has been, and it can be all that we imagine it to be. That's my vision for justice. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, my name is Shari Davis. I'm the Executive Director at the Participatory Budgeting Project. You caught us at the 4th installment of our Visions for Justice series, and we're so happy that you joined us. Thank you for sharing your vision for justice. We can't wait to see you 2 weeks from now when we do the next installment of our Vision for Justice series. And if you know someone that should have been in this conversation today but couldn't make it, that's okay. Take a step for them and send them the recording of this conversation that will be online very soon. Thank you all for joining us.